tale that I would like to share with you today is an African folk tale called The Fairy Frog. Tombe Inde was the most beautiful princess in her village. Her eyes were brown like the dough, and when she led the dance, it was like the feet of a gazelle. Her name, Tombe Inde, meant tall maiden, and in fact, she carried herself and her head high. Her parents believed that one day she would be a mighty queen, and they looked on her with love and joy and pride. Now, Tombe Inde had some sisters who were not quite as tall, nor quite as beautiful or admired as she. In fact, they became more and more jealous every day until they came to the point that they forgot the love that they had for Tombe Inde and decided that if they were going to get any kind of admiration, they had to get rid of her. So they devised a plan. They invited her to go with them to the red ochre pit to dig for some red ochre for the crawl. Off they went, singing and laughing all the way the miles to the red ochre pit. And when they got there, each of the girls took turns leaping into the pit, digging up some red ochre, and leaping out again with the help of her sisters. But when it was the turn for Tombe Inde, her sisters, after she leaped into the pit and dug her red ochre, they did not allow her or help her out of the pit. In fact, they started getting picks full of red ochre and throwing it into the pit until she was covered. Then they all ran away back to their village. And when they got back there, they had left their sister behind, and their father, the king, asked them, "Where's your sister?" And they said, we had to leave her behind because she fell into the pit, and before we could help her out, the dirt fell in on her and she got smothered. Now, there was something about the way each of them told the story that the king suspected something was afoul because each of their stories was different. He called his guard and told them to put these girls into a hut and keep them locked away. Back at the pit, however, Tombe Inde was not dead, for even though the earth on her was heavy, there were breaks in it that she could breathe through. And she started to chant, "I am Tombe Inde, I am not dead, I am alive like one of you." And she kept singing all the hours and hours, "I am Tombe Inde, I am not dead, I am alive like one of you." And she kept singing for hours and hours, and it seemed that she would never be rescued. Finally, it was becoming evening, and she was giving up hope when she thought she heard something above her on the ledge of the pit. So she started to sing even louder, "I am Tombe Inde, I am not dead, I am alive like one of you. I am Tombe Inde, I am not dead, I am alive like one of you." And in fact, there was on the ledge above her a gigantic frog. The frog said to her, what befalls you, fair maiden?" And she said, "Alas, my sisters hate me, and they wanted to get rid of me, and I cannot get out of the pit." The frog said, "I will help you." So he jumped down into the pit, and he began to dig until he uncovered her. And then he opened his great big mouth and swallowed her in one big gulp. Then he jumped up and started jumping down the path. Now, he wanted to make sure that none of the creatures around in the forest would come and eat him, so he began to sing, "I carry the princess, the one they buried in the red pit." And he was able to go along his way without any of the birds or any of the other creatures bothering him. Now, they decided that he would not go back to her village because of the jealous sisters, but they would go on to Tombe Inde's grandmother's house where they were sure to be welcome. He also wanted to make sure that he stayed clear of any other crawls because frogs were considered to be a bad omen. So the frog jumped along all through the night, and about the middle of the day he stopped, and he opened his mouth, and with a big croak allowed Tombe Inde to come out. He croaked 3 times, and out jumped a pot of porridge, and he told Tombe Inde, eat and rest until it's time for us to go again. She ate, and she fell asleep under the bushes. That night, when it was time to continue on their journey, the frog told her, come, it's time to go. And he opened his great big mouth, and he swallowed her again with one big gulp. He jumped along and hopped along, avoiding the other craws until he came to the grandmother's kraal. He jumped right up to the chief's hut, and he called out, I'm carrying the Princess Tombe Inde, who they buried in the red pit. And he continued to call out until the grandmother rushed out and said, who is it? Who's speaking? Who knows what happened to my darling Tombe Inde? The frog said, it is I know what happened to her. Bring fresh, clean mats and lay them before me, and you'll see. So the women of the kraal went around, and they gathered all the clean mats they could find, and they laid them before the frog. And he opened up his big mouth, and out walked Tombe Inde, as beautiful and tall as she had always been. The women almost fainted at the sight of Tombe Inde, and then their amazement turned to joy, and they danced and they celebrated because Tombe Inde was with them. Oh, please, Mr. Frog, what can we do for you to thank you for bringing our dear Tombe Inde back to us? He thought for a moment, and he said, well, just spread out a feast before me. And they did just that. And the big frog sat right beside Tombe Inde the whole time and enjoyed all of the preparations and thanks and honor that he was given. Meanwhile, the grandmother had sent word to the king and let him know that Tombe Inde was alive. So the king did indeed allow his daughters to come out of the hut, giving them the order to make some royal robes for Tombe Inde when she returned. He got his favorite son and sent the prince to the grandmother's house to fetch Tombe Inde. The prince arrived and rested a while, and Tombe Inde the next morning was looking for the fairy frog, but could not find him. So she prepared to go back home. So the brother and the sister set off to go down the road back to the Minnie Mouse, to their village. And the mad thing is that the heat and dry weather were their companions down the road. And after a while, they became very thirsty. And they were wondering where could they find water, because all the streams along the way were all dried up. They looked ahead of them on the path, and they saw a man. Now, other than his gigantic size, he was like any other man. And they welcomed him and greeted him with thanksgiving. And he answered them, "What do you want?" And they were surprised at his voice, because it was like deep, deep bass, and it was like rumbling thunder. And though they were frightened, they let him know that they needed water. And he said, "Well, what will you give me in exchange for the water?" And without thinking, the prince said, "Anything in my father's kingdom you may have." The giant man thought a minute, and he looked at the princess, and he said, "Well, then I'll have this beautiful princess." The brother was astounded. If he gave his sister to the giant, then he didn't know what might befall her. But if they continued on the road with no water, they would both be in trouble. The only thing he could think to do was for both of them to go with the giant and get water. So the giant looked at them for a while, and he laughed. And then he took them over to a giant fig tree, and he took a stick and he hit the roots of the tree and out sprang a fountain of water. The brother and sister were so delighted. They jumped into the water. They let the water bathe on their faces, and they drank eagerly, getting their sustenance again. As they were drinking, the princess looked up, and as her eyes met the giant, she shrieked, because before her, the giant had turned into a horrible ogre. He was misshapen. He had this red, spiky hair, and he had pointy teeth that kept his mouth from even being able to close. And she was so afraid, and the brother, upon hearing her screams, looked and saw this misshapen ogre, and he too knew that they were in big, big trouble. He knew that this ogre was too powerful, and no amount of fighting was going to save them. But all of a sudden, out of the fountain jumped the gigantic frog and stood in between the brother and sister and the giant ogre. The ogre looked at him with disdain and laughed in disbelief, but the frog was not fazed. He allowed the ogre to laugh at him for a while, and then he opened his giant mouth and swallowed him in one big gulp, tail and all. Then he jumped into the fountain and stayed there until the ogre was drowned. He returned to Tombe Inde and her brother, and she said, "Oh, frog, you must not disappear this time. You must go back with us to our father's kraal and get the honor that you so deserve." So the three of them went back to the father's house, and there he was standing with his guards, and at the head of the guards he stood welcoming his two favorite children. He embraced them with love and joy. But he looked at the frog and he said, "Why did you bring this horrible frog with you? Let's kill him." And Tombe Inde said, No, father, for this is the most wonderful of creatures. He saved my life twice. You cannot harm him." And at these words, she looked up, and the frog had become the most handsome prince. He was regaled in otter skins and ostrich plumes, and all the people around were just excited knowing that he was indeed a prince. And he said, "I am no frog, I am indeed a prince. My father is a great chief. And you, king, sir, if you will give me your daughter's hand in marriage, you will receive 100 cattle." So a few days later, Tombe Inde and the fairy frog were married. And as for those wicked sisters, the king forgave them. And Tombe Inde soon forgot the things that they had done to her, because she was only concerned about her happiness in her new home. The story of Tombe Inde and the fairy prince.